the Tundra Connection series with Polar Bears International.
Okay.
Sound good?
Sounds good now. Who knows what's going on there? Okay. Again, we'll do that pre-roll, and then we'll go with you.
Perfect.
Hello and welcome to the latest instalment of the Tundra Connections program with Polar Bears International. It is Polar Bear season in Churchill, Manitoba. We are coming at you live from the shores of Hudson Bay from Buggy One. And it is Polar Bear Week as well, so thank you very much for paying attention to our programming and competitions and other activities this week. And we'll have plenty more for you. We've had some great bear activity today, and we're going to have some bears around us during the course of this webcast, hopefully, and we'll be able to bring you live footage like this fella right now. We're going to have a slightly different conversation. My name is Kieran Mulvaney from Polar Bears International. I am the author of The Great White Bear, A Natural and Unnatural History of the Polar Bear, but we're not going to talk about polar bears specifically, at least not to begin with. We're going to expand the conversation to something a little bit different, and helping me to do that is Dr. Katharine Hayhoe. She is director of the Climate Science Center and a professor at Texas Tech University, but we're here to talk to her for reasons in addition to that. Because, Katharine, you occupy what for scientists might be perceived to be a couple of very different and perhaps incompatible positions on the spectrum. You are, as I've said, a well-respected climate scientist, an excellent climate communicator, but a few years ago, and we use the term slightly jokingly, slightly intentionally, you came out as an evangelical Christian.
Yes.
And that's been an important part, not only for you personally, but also professionally for you to have done that. Perhaps you can explain a little bit about what motivated you to indeed come out, as it were.
Yes, absolutely. That's a great question. So as a scientist, let me shift this way so I can look at you too. As a scientist, it doesn't matter where we park our behind on Sundays or Saturdays, depending on what side, or whether it remains in bed, as most people probably prefer. A good scientist is a good scientist. It doesn't matter what part of the world you come from, it doesn't matter what language you speak, and it certainly doesn't matter what faith you have. So that, in essence, is irrelevant to doing good science. But what I came to realize, specifically studying climate change, was that when you look at groups of people and you look at who least agrees with the science of climate change, white evangelicals and white Catholics, too, I hate to say, are battling it out in the lowest rungs of people who agree that climate is changing due to human activities and that we need to do something about it. So I decided very deliberately that if I was going to be able to speak to people that I shared so much of my life with, I had to tell them, hey, this is who I am, this is what I believe, this is so much that we have in common. Here's this extra little bit that you might not know yet, but I think it is entirely compatible with what you believe. And not only that, but I think it's necessary for us to be at the forefront of saying we need to make some different choices if what we have in our hearts is to, first of all, love others, and second of all, to take responsibility for the planet that God has given us.
And that goes to, I think, a very interesting kind of follow-up question, which is, how do your faith and your scientific knowledge combine to emphasize, exacerbate, if you will, and inform your level of concern for and commitment to protecting Earth and indeed its nature?
An interesting Pew Foundation survey came out just a few weeks ago that looked at what people think of religion and science. And what they found is that the people who were least religious thought that religious people had the most conflict with science. And the people who were most religious thought that they had the least conflict with science. So often science and faith are presented as two alternate belief systems. But I don't believe in science. Science is what you see and observe all around you. And so one of my favorite verses from the Bible, actually, talks about this. Let me see if I can put it on here. Yes. So this is a verse from Hebrews, chapter 11, and it defines faith for us. It says that faith is the substance of what we hope for, in other words, in the future, what we anticipate, and the evidence of things not seen. So if I were back then when they were writing this, I would have jogged their elbow and I would have said, hey, isn't that exactly the opposite of science? Science is the substance of what is here and now. We can observe it, we can measure it, we can see it, and is the evidence of what we can observe right now. So rather than being two alternate systems of belief that are in conflict, there are two completely different ways of understanding the world around us that use different perspectives, different tools, and even different time frames.
I mean, you've used the analogy, I think, that science and faith are basically two sides of the very same coin, and that's the way of looking at the world that way. Because, and it's interesting because, I'm curious what kind of a reaction you might have had initially, because it does seem strange that it has to be a big deal in a sense.
I know.
To announce what your religion is. Yet, if there is a community in which it is a strange thing to do, it is often the science community.
It is, and so that's why I have a colleague in Texas, but the other side of Texas. So Texas is a very big state, and from one side to the other is about 10 hours. So I have this great colleague on the other side in Houston called Elaine Eklund, and she is a sociologist who studies scientists and religion. So what she found is she did a groundbreaking study of thousands of scientists at research universities, and she found that scientists are predominantly spiritual people. That the vast majority of scientists would describe themselves as spiritual people, adhering to various forms of faith and religion, not necessarily, all evangelical Christians by any means, but a surprising number are, and a surprising number have come out of the woodwork, so to speak, in the last few years. And so now I can name, 5 years ago, I could name on the fingers of one hand colleagues I had who shared my beliefs. And now I would use all my fingers, all my toes, and I would still need a few more digits to count all the ones that I know of. So the idea that scientists are not spiritual people is not, first of all, supported by the data. And then the second thing, which I thought was really interesting, was when my husband and I wrote a book together. So my husband, in addition to being a professor and a linguist, is also a pastor. So we wrote this book together on why Christians would care about climate change. So when we wrote this book, I was really wondering what would happen. I just pictured this terrible scenario where all my colleagues just lost complete respect for me, and where I started getting hate mail and started getting blackballed by my scientific colleagues.
Awkward silences in the canteen.
Yes, exactly. And what happened was exactly the opposite from what I expected. I had colleagues go out of their way to come up to me to say either, coming up to me maybe like at the coffee table at a meeting saying, we're reading your book in our group at church.
Interesting.
Or even saying, I don't share your beliefs at all, but I appreciate what you're doing, and I think that's exactly what we need to be doing, is connecting this to everybody's faith. So I've had great support from my fellow scientists, but from the Christian community, it's been exactly the opposite.
Really?
Yes. I would say about a good 50% of the really evil, nasty comments I get on social media, old-fashioned letters, email, come from people who self-identify as Christians.
Now, what do you think is behind that? Is that because there's a resistance to or hostility to science, because science is perceived as being this alternate force to spirituality and religion, or what do you think is behind that?
It's specifically, I think, related to climate
Okay.
change, yes, because we use science in our life every day, right? I mean, you turn on your car, you pick up your phone, you turn on the computer, you switch on the lights. We're using science. So there's not very many people who are really anti-science in the world today. But there's a lot of people who are anti-climate change in the world today. About half the people in the United States are. And why are we? It isn't because it's actually incompatible with our faith. It's because we've been told by people who we trust, who share many of our values in other areas, that climate change isn't real, that it's a big hoax. And so anybody who dares to stand up and say, I am a Christian, I do share your beliefs, and climate change is real, is essentially a traitor to the cause.
Right. One of the things that my own little theological question, when
Yeah.
I kind of brought to this, and I don't know if it's a
Absolutely.
tremendously naive one, but one that interests me is, you hear it come up sometimes, there is, early on, I think in Genesis, the notion that God gave man dominion over earth and its animals. And I assume that has been subject to various different interpretations
Of course.
over many generations.
Yes.
And one that I assume has been the dominant interpretation for a long time is that, well, it's ours then. We can do whatever we want and it doesn't matter.
Yes.
I imagine now there is increasingly a move towards an understanding, perhaps a stewardship. I'm not sure if stewardship is
Yeah,
the correct
that
word.
is exactly the right
But for
word, yeah.
recognizing that, no, we're a part of it, and it's our responsibility. It might be God's creation, but what he was saying was, this is your responsibility to deal with it properly. Is that fair to say?
Yes, it is. So Bible translation is one of those topics that you will never get to the bottom of. So depending on which translation you read, you can get the word dominion being used, or you could get the simple word responsibility being used. So in other words, if you look at Genesis 1, you can find verses that say, we have been given responsibility over every living thing. But in the old King James language, that's interpreted as dominion. So people have taken that, and they still do today, to say, first of all, we can do whatever we want, and second of all, it's all going to end anyway, so why do we care? But you can refute both of those directly from the Bible, and that's the beauty of it. If you look at any examples of dominion, kingship, leadership, having authority over in the Bible, there are many, many examples of good kings and bad kings, of good leaders and bad leaders. And the bad leaders were the ones who said, oh, well, I'm in charge of it, so I can do whatever I want. And the good leaders were the ones who grew whatever they were in charge of and invested in it, make sure that it flourished under their care. And we see the same today. So a CEO, for example, or the owner of a company, has dominion over the company. What would we think of Bill Gates if he just ran Microsoft into the ground and just, squeezed every last penny out of it for his own personal gain and said, well, you know what, it's all going to end anyway, so I'm just going to party while it lasts. We wouldn't respect somebody like that.
Right.
So why would we respect somebody who treats the earth like that? And then the other issue of the fact of saying, it's all going to end anyways, that is a big one, because it gives people a very temporal mentality towards this planet. But again, then you can go to, in this case, the New Testament, the book of Thessalonians, where there are people there who are quitting their jobs. This is way back when, 2,000 years ago. They're quitting their jobs, they're sitting around, they're going, oh, well, the world's going to end anyways, right? So just, enjoy it while it lasts. And the Apostle Paul wrote to them, and he said, get a job, support your family, take care of the poor and the widows and the people who don't have resources, because you don't know when the day or the time is. So in the meantime, you are supposed to be known by your love for other people. That is what we're supposed to be identified by. And so when you think of it from that perspective, you don't have to have some alternate belief system to care about climate change. The Christian belief system is perfectly suited not only to agree that climate change is real and that we have a responsibility to do something about it, both from a creation care perspective as well as a people care perspective, but I really think we should be on the front lines. I mean, when your core beliefs tell you to take care of the planet and take care of people, and climate change is devastating the planet and putting people in harm's way, how can you be true to your values if you just stand by and let that happen? Or even worse, if you bury your head in the sand and say, it's not even happening, la 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 la.
But sort of connected to that, what you do hear quite often is people who maybe haven't made that shift, that we talk about climate change and people pick up on us saying that it is such a severe situation, that we are so profoundly altering God's creation. Yet conversely, God is all-powerful. And why is he going to step back and let us do this? If we're doing this, then where's God? Like, it can't, you've heard some of the folks on the right going, it's far too arrogant to assume that we, as human beings, can be doing this to the climate. God wouldn't be letting us do this.
Yes. And again, the answer is not in science. The answer is simple. It's the issue of free will. Because if God wanted to create a bunch of robots, then that certainly could happen. But we definitely have free will to make good and bad decisions. And so there's all kinds of guidance about you reap what you sow. Whatever choice you make has consequences. And so we know that we have the ability to make choices have consequences. And climate change is nothing more than the consequences of decisions that we made centuries ago. We didn't know the implications of those choices back then when we first started digging coal and oil and gas out of the ground and burning it in massive quantities, but we know the consequences now. And so now we are supposed to use our sound minds to make better choices. Another one of my favorite verses, if I can share it with you here, is, let's see if I can get it. Just a second. Here we go. I love this verse. This is kind of a litmus test. So when you hear people talking about climate change, you often hear fear. You hear fear that the whole planet's going to hell in a handbasket and it's all going to end. Or you hear fear that the economy is going to be destroyed if you listen to all those fear mongers about climate change. I mean, you just hear fear, 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 no matter what side of the spectrum you listen to. And so what I love here is it specifically says that the fear is not coming from God. What comes from God is a spirit of power, getting stuff done, a spirit of love and care for others, for the planet and for people, and, as a scientist, I love this one, and a sound mind to make, smart choices. We didn't know 300 years ago that this would happen. We know it's happening now. So now it's time to apply our sound mind in a spirit of love to get stuff done.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that you talked about a little bit earlier that suggests that I get the impression is key is you talked about the fact that climate change is going to have consequences, negative consequences for a lot of people, a lot of us. And that therefore, this isn't necessarily specifically a Christian issue, but the Christian ethic not only is consistent with wanting to take action to protect our fellow humans, but it almost compels action in order to protect our fellow people, because we are going to have people around the world. We are already having people who are suffering as a consequence of climate change.
Exactly. We often think of the polar bear as the most iconic species of climate change. As you can see right here, this is the polar bear.
There's one icon right
yes,
there.
This is the polar bear having a nice little afternoon nap right outside our buggy.
Not doing
right
anything to help his own species.
No, no. We have been given tremendous benefits that are also sometimes a curse. So there's a polar bear being a bit more active too on the other side. So we often think of the polar bear perched on a melting iceberg as the iconic image of climate change. And it's true that the polar bears are one of the most vulnerable species, and that's why we're here today. But if you look around the world, and I spent a number of years when I was young living in Colombia, for example, South America, and there's people there who live in homes made of cardboard Tide boxes. And there's people who live in shacks made out of bamboo, perched on the side of a hill that when it rains, they all get swept down the hill. I mean, there's people living so close to the edge around the world. If food prices double, half the family goes hungry. These are the people who are being impacted by climate change already today. On average, per year since 1980, there's been $5 billion worth of lost crops every year due to the increased risks associated with climate change. We've always had flood and drought. We've always had heat waves and pests and cold snaps. But climate change is increasing the risk of many of these severe weather types. Specifically heat waves getting more frequent, heavy downpours getting stronger and more frequent, sea level rising, hurricanes and typhoons and tropical storms getting stronger. And all of these are impacting us as people. They're impacting us because we've built the assumption of a stable climate into our system, and it is no longer stable. And that is what makes us so vulnerable. But what's amazing, and really why I'm here today, is because my perspective is very human focused. I work a lot with cities. I work with development organizations even, like World Vision. I work with states and provinces, and I work with people who are trying to figure out how to prepare for a changing climate. And so this is my focus. And then 6 months ago, I sat down for breakfast with Steve Amstrup. And Steve asked me to come north with Polar Bears International. And so I thought to myself, well, but the polar bear is kind of the stereotype of climate change, and I'm really very concerned about how it's going to impact people. But what Steve had to say convinced me. So that's why I wanted to bring him in too, to share with you what he has to say.
With a brilliant segue, almost as if we prepared this in advance. It does indeed seem a perfect opportunity to bring in Dr. Steve Amstrup, who was formerly the chief polar bear researcher in Alaska for the United States Geological Survey. He is now the chief scientist for Polar Bears International. And Steve, it is a good point to come in on. We're here because of polar bears. We care about polar bears. We care about the Arctic. We care about the impacts on them of climate change. But as Katharine said, it isn't just about polar bears. And I'm sure you must have had many situations where you've been giving talks about polar bears and where you're trying to emphasize the importance of climate change, where people have asked you, well, how is this relevant to me? How is this relevant to other people? There are people starving here and you're talking about polar bears. But it is all relevant, isn't it? Because the climate change impacts affect so much more than these beautiful animals out here.
Yeah, as Katharine said, the polar bear has indeed become the fuzzy face of climate change. People think of global warming or climate change, and an image of a polar bear on the block of ice, like Katharine described, is often what comes into their minds. But if you think about what is the real threat to the polar bear, the real threat to the polar bear is the loss of sea ice, because polar bears get all of their food by catching it from the surface of the ice. So, to reduce that down to the simplest term, for the polar bear, the threat of climate change is a food security issue. Mm-hmm. And what Katharine was just describing in being concerned about people that live close to the earth, have modest means, they are facing and will continue to face accelerating food insecurity. So, linking polar bears to people may at first seem a little difficult, a little bit of a jump, because we're way up here in the north, we're covered by snow, and what does this have to do with anybody who lives at lower latitudes? But in fact, the threats are the same. But the value of understanding the threat to polar bears is that because polar bears live on this environment that literally melts as temperatures rise, we can see those changes very easily. Some of the changes that are impacting lower latitude ecosystems and people who live in lower latitudes are more complicated, more difficult to see. The systems may be more erratic, and the forest, the prairie, whatever, is a more complicated ecosystem, but ultimately it boils down to what we're seeing in polar bears now is ultimately going to come to all of the species on Earth that we care about, including ourselves.
Indeed, whether you are religious or secular or whatever your religion might be, for some people it can in fact be a lot easier to get into an issue, to care about, to comprehend it through looking at these animals that we're looking at right now. And as you said, a very simple linear depiction of what is going on, and that can be an entryway into these more complicated issues.
That's absolutely right. We know that many of the things that are happening to the environment and that have been projected to happen are quite complicated. And there's a lot of uncertainty about them. But it's virtually certain that we are going to face more human hunger. Mm-hmm. And so if you care at all about people, that ought to be a concern. And even if you don't care about people, but all you care about is the wildlife that are out there, if that's your main concern, we also know that hungry people can't do conservation. So regardless of what angle you come at it, whether it's from a wildlife biology perspective or a human justice perspective, the issues are the same, the solutions are the same. We know we have solutions. We just need to apply ourselves to get there.
Talking of the many different hats that a person can wear or the different ways that they come at it, you're not just a scientist, you're not just a Christian, you're a mother.
Yes.
You're up here on the front lines of climate change, where the changes are very, very clear, very obvious. You're here with your young son Gavin, and I can't help but wonder as you look at polar bears, as you look at the Arctic, as you consider the situation, the way things are changing, and obviously you have a lot more understanding of what might be lying ahead than a lot of people. What kind of thoughts do you have about what future lies ahead for Gavin?
Yeah. Probably one of the biggest reasons why many of us care about this issue is because if you're a parent, you would do anything for your child to ensure that they grow up in a world that is safe, that is fair, that makes sure that will give them the access to all of the resources and advantages that you enjoyed and then some. And so when you're up here and you're looking at these amazing animals, and you're just thinking what an incredible world this is with so much diversity, how can you not want to share that with your child? And how can you not want your child to grow up in a world where the polar bears continue to exist because they're able to continue to feed, but people are also able to live in a safe and secure world? I mean, you look at the news across the world, on the other side of the world in Syria, you think, what would it be like to be a mom in Syria right now? To know that your child is in danger every time they step onto the street, that there's not enough food to feed them. We don't want our kids to grow up in a world like that. You might say, well, what does that have to do with climate change? Syria was already a very unstable state. It already had terrible political problems. It had a long history that contributed to where it is today. But there was one extra factor that helped to push it over the edge, and that was the fact that a few years ago they had a terrible drought that drove people into the cities. people that otherwise would have been living on their farms. Unemployment shot up to over 50%. And all of a sudden there were all these people in the cities with no job, no way to get food, ripe for the match to land on. And so we see this all around the world. In fact, this is not my own perspective. This is very much the perspective of the Pentagon and the DoD, is that climate change is a threat multiplier. It takes security threats around the world and it adds that little extra bit on top that in some cases might make the difference between pushing it over the edge or leaving it where it is. And why do we care about conflict? We care about that because what's the first thing to go when states fall apart? The first thing to go is you have no public health, you have no education. Women start dying of ridiculous things like giving birth, it's completely avoidable reasons. I mean, it immediately puts women and children at risk to live in an unstable society. And so yes, these issues will always happen. We have had civil conflict and international conflict and political conflict as long as there's been people around to have the conflict. But today we know that climate change is exacerbating that conflict and is putting people at risk.
The word that comes to mind listening to you say that, and I don't think we've used this word yet, is compassion.
Yeah.
It's not even just about an obligation or an ethic or whatever. It is having that sense of compassion and having a broad circle of compassion for people in your community, in your state, in your country, globally, and for other creatures. It's really a simple, compassionate issue.
It is, exactly. Like, for example, if you look at this this slide, this is a picture of where our carbon emissions come from that are driving this issue of climate change. So if you look at where our carbon emissions are come from, Alaska looks a little guiltier than it is just by association with the United States. But over the last 100 years or so, about a third of emissions have come from the United States. About 8 or 9% has come from China, but China passed the U.S. on an annual basis a couple of years ago. But now what most people don't realize is China is number 1 in the world in wind energy, number 1 in solar. China cut their emissions last year for the first time, and they actually have a policy plan in place to bring their emissions down. Now contrast this map that I just showed you with this next map that shows where people are most vulnerable to climate change. Ready? Look at that. When you look at that, you're right, it's the compassion that immediately comes to the front. This is not fair. It is not fair that people who did not contribute to this problem are bearing the brunt of the impacts. And it's not fair that incredible animals like the polar bear are bearing the brunt of the impacts when they did nothing to contribute to it. So it is a sense of compassion, I believe, that should motivate us. And I think compassion and love are much more motivating than a sense of kind of cold duty or cold responsibility. Like, I should do this, but I don't really want to do it. It's completely different than saying, my heart compels me to do it.
And Steve, I wanted to circle back to a question that I asked Katharine. A friend of mine, friend of yours, I'm sure, who's studied ring seals of Alaska for many, many years, has said to me that one of the things that makes him the most sad as he contemplates climate changes in the Arctic is the fact that for decades he spent all his time on the sea ice, and he always wanted his son to be able to spend years or decades perhaps on the sea ice. And one of the things that pains him is his son's not going to be able to do that because there isn't going to be the sea ice for him, to experience that. You are also a father, and I'm curious how, as you have witnessed these changes and as you've studied them, thinking again as a father and for future generations what this means to you.
During my career, I saw the sea ice in the Arctic change so dramatically from having sea ice along the shore all year round, so you could stand on the beach in northern Alaska and see the ice right from the shore in the summertime. And now it's so far offshore it's beyond the curvature of the earth. It saddens me deeply. I can't deny that I have an emotional attachment here to have seen those changes. My daughter was able to get out with me one time on the ice, and that was a wonderful, wonderful thing. But it'll probably never happen again. And, so yes, I'm very concerned about the ability of future generations to appreciate some of the things that I've been able to appreciate. We used to always say that one of the duties of a parent is to create a better world, to help create a better world for their children. So not only, like Katharine said, not only the benefits that I've had, but more. We want our children always to have more. I think that's a natural parental instinct. And yet, if we don't do something about what's affecting the polar bears now and what soon will be affecting all of us, they are not going to have more. When we think of what the world that our children is going to face looks like, it doesn't look very good without us taking some action.
Mm-hmm.
And as Katharine said, we didn't intend to do this.
Yeah.
When we first punched the hole in the ground and,
Right.
and got oil out and started driving cars around,
Oh.
that was just humans doing what humans have always done, making tools, figuring out how to make a better life. Climate change is an unintended consequence, but it's a consequence that we recognize, that we are responsible for. And it's our duty, therefore, to do something about it.
And it's time.
And it's time.
I mean, do you think that's a key argument? Because sometimes one gets a sense that there's a bit of resistance. We're only using what was put there for us to use. Why are you blaming us for this? It was there for us to use. And perhaps that it is important, as Steve says, to, well, okay, it's happened.
Yeah.
The
Exactly.
key now is to take that responsibility.
I think that's essential because, first of all, if we look at the Industrial Revolution, we wouldn't be sitting here today if it wasn't for the Industrial Revolution. I think I would have just died of some terrible disease long ago if it wasn't for the Industrial Revolution. Many, many people's lives have been saved and improved and educated, and we have learned so much about this world, just even what we've learned to enable us to do conservation, for example, because of the Industrial Revolution. So it does not help the self-flagellation, the saying, "Oh, we're terrible people." I mean, I was at a workshop one time where, it was a workshop with a lot of people from various Catholic and Protestant traditions, talking about how we could talk to our communities about climate change. And I still remember one guy just stood up. He said, "Well, driving is a sin. Every time you turn on your car, you are committing a sin, and everybody needs to know that." And my very human reaction was, I thought, I would just like to go get in a Hummer and drive circles around him because that is not helpful. So I don't think that saying, "Oh, we've been terrible people, we have to repent from these terrible things we've done," that is not what we're talking about here, because we, did not know what was going to happen when this first started. Although by the 1800s, actually, we had a pretty good idea.
Right.
Scientists did. They weren't talking to the public by then, but they were publishing scientific studies. And in the 1800s, we did know that humans were producing carbon, that it was building up in the atmosphere, and that the temperature of the planet was increasing. But in the 1800s, scientists thought it would take thousands of years to get as warm as we now know it will be within this century. So it isn't helpful to look back and say, "Oh, we're terrible people." No, the Industrial Revolution brought tremendous benefits. But it also brought the knowledge, the understanding, and to a certain extent even the technology that we need to fix this problem. So rather than looking backwards, the healthy and the beneficial thing I think to do is to look forwards and to say, how can we act in a way that is consistent with our values to do something about this problem, helping people and helping the planet at the same time.
It's more or less time for us to wrap this up, but sort of as a closing thought, I was thinking in terms of a question. You have,
what can we do about it?
Yeah, exactly. But one of the things I was going to ask was, first of all, before we do that, was what is the kind of message that is going to resonate then? Following on from that, if we can't say, fire and brimstone, you're all sinners, you've all failed. What are the kind of messages that do resonate? Or maybe if not even a message, as much as a means. It's
a reminder. Yes. There's this wonderful verse in James that says, if you are not behaving correctly, it doesn't say feel guilty, repent, beat your breast, you're a terrible person. It says if you're not behaving correctly, you are like a man who looked in a mirror and went away and forgot what he looks like. So they said if you're not doing the right thing, you have forgotten who you are. So the message is, who are we? Remember who we are. And if we remember who we are, we will be acting in a way that is consistent with who we are. And who we are people who want to love other people, have compassion for other people, and have responsibility and care for God's creation.
I mean, what about yourself, Steve? I mean, what kind of messages do you feel? I mean, you've obviously come up against people who, might be a little bit resistant, and maybe you found that there were just certain types of messaging, certain ways of approaching people that resonate. And perhaps it's, again, the compassion issue. Yeah. But once again, somebody may come up, they may not understand, they may disagree with you, but simply finding a way that you have common ground.
Yeah, and I think, the finding of common ground is really pretty important for people who either don't understand or are, at this point, dismissive. And that depends on who you're talking to, what the sphere is, whether they're people you engage at church or whether they're people you engage when you're at the ski area. I mean, people have different interests, but we scientists share those interests. I think the most important thing is to figure out how to connect with them, and then to make sure they understand that we're not blaming anybody here, but we're saying we do need to do something about this, and most importantly, we can. And, you know, I come at it from a wildlife management, wildlife biology perspective, and, you know, today we've been having this discussion kind of connecting polar bears to people. A colleague of mine, Mike Crowther, the director of the Indianapolis Zoological Society, who is also all about animals, has a great statement. He says, our mission should really be to provide our children with a world that they could enjoy and that they might choose, rather than one that they're forced to endure.
Yeah.
And, you know, to me, that really says it all. We can do that, and I think it's our duty to do that.
I heard somebody say something else really good this week too. There's a famous Mark Twain quote about how climate is what you expect and weather's what you get. Well, what one of our colleagues said is, weather's what you get and climate is what you give to your children.
Oh, wow.
What type of climate are we going to give our children?
Well, I do not doubt that we have gotten people of faith, and perhaps people not of faith, all fired up and excited over the last 40 minutes or so. What can people do?
What can we do? Exactly. If we talk about a challenge, if we talk about a problem, and we don't offer practical, viable solutions, what's the point? So that's why one of my favorite organizations is, as you can see right here on the slide, it's an organization called Climate Caretakers. It's so hard for each of us to say, you know, what should we individually be doing? Well, what Climate Caretakers does is every month it gives us something that we specifically can do, and it tracks how much all of us are doing together. So just as an example, if everyone in the United States switched out one old school light bulb for a new LED, not only would we save about $30 in energy costs over the lifetime of the bulb, that would be like taking 1 million cars off the road. Isn't that crazy? So working together in community, we can get things done, and that's why I love Climate Caretakers. I also love another organization called Climate Stewards, because sometimes we can't reduce what we do. There are certain things that we can't reduce. So what they do is they say, all right, how much carbon did you produce by going to see your family for Christmas? Don't beat yourself up. Don't not go see your family. But how much carbon did you produce? Here's how much it would cost for a farmer in Kenya to take that carbon out of the air. And that's what you can do. There's even bigger things we can do, though. Churches are putting solar panels on their roofs, and then they're asking the local community if they want to buy into the solar garden, because solar in bulk is a lot cheaper than individual solar installations on your roof. But the bottom line is, too, we have to tell people that we want something different. So that's why one of the only organizations that I serve on the board of, and one of the only organizations with the word lobby in it, for sure, that I've ever been associated with in my life, is Citizens Climate Lobby, because they have a chapter in every state and most towns across Canada and the US, and they're all about going to our elected officials and saying, we do not care what color you are. You could be red, blue, green, orange, or who knows what. Whatever political color you are, we know that we need to work together to fix climate. And so let's get it done.
Fantastic. Very inspiring. And it's been great to have a conversation. It's a little different from the ones that we normally have. It's good. We're in this very unusual location, and it's a magnificent place to be. But it's good to be able to sort of look at the world beyond our very unusual present environment. Dr. Katharine Hayhoe, Dr. Stephen Amstrup, thank you so very much for joining us. I hope it's been a really interesting and enlightening discussion for everybody out there. Please do continue to follow all our programming during Polar Bear Week and beyond. And for more information on this topic and on others related, do visit our website, polarbearsinternational.org. Follow us on Twitter @PolarBears, and also like our Facebook page. Once again, Polar Bears International. We will have more for you with the Tundra Connections program during Polar Bear Week and perhaps even beyond. So thank you very much for joining us from the shores of Hudson Bay on Buggy One. For Dr. Stephen Amstrup and Dr. Katharine Hayhoe, I am Kieran Mulvaney for Polar Bears International. Thank you once again for joining us.